know that there's been this sort of battle royale brewing between the Trump administration and some legacy media outlets. I talked about one of those on the show when they banned the Associated Press from Oval Office events because the AP won't write Gulf of America. They are writing Gulf of Mexico. And I said, look, am I going to call it the Gulf of America? Yes. But the Associated Press actually had a pretty sound rationale. For instance, the other one, changing Mount Denali to Mount McKinley, they said, fine, we're going to call that what Trump wants to call it because that's within the confines of the United States and he has the power to do that. But they said the Gulf of Mexico, it borders Mexico and the U.S. Other places call it other things. We're an international news outlet. And so we have to be consistent. So we're going to continue to call it the Gulf of Mexico, but we'll also put in parentheses referred to as the Gulf of America in the United States. I think that's fair. I think it's reasonable. But the Trump administration said, no, you can't come to Oval Office events. And I just think that's a stupid fight to pick. So the fight gets stupider. I don't love this. In fact, I really, really hate it. Caroline Leavitt, the White House press secretary, came out. We're going to play her whole statement. She read a prepared statement and basically said the White House Correspondents Association will no longer control sort of who gets a seat in the press briefings and other presidential press events, and instead it will be controlled by the White House itself.
As you all know, for decades, a group of DC-based journalists, the White House Correspondents Association, has long dictated which journalists get to ask questions of the President of the United States in these most intimate spaces. Not anymore. I am proud to announce that we are going to give the power back to the people who read your papers, who watch your television shows, and who listen to your radio stations. Moving forward, the White House press pool will be determined by the White House press team. Legacy outlets who have participated in the press pool for decades will still be allowed to join, fear not, but we will also be offering the privilege to well-deserving outlets who have never been allowed to share in this awesome responsibility. Just like we added a new media seat in this briefing room, legacy media outlets who have been here for years will still participate in the pool, but new voices are going to be welcomed in as well. As part of these changes, we will continue the rotation amongst the 5 major television networks to ensure the president's remarks are heard far and wide around this world. We will add additional streaming services which reach different audiences than traditional cable and broadcast. This is the ever-changing landscape of the media in the United States today. We will continue to rotate a print pooler who has the great responsibility of quickly transcribing the president's remarks and disseminating them to the rest of the world. And we will add outlets to the print pool rotation who have long been denied the privilege to partake in this experience, but are committed to covering this White House beat. We will continue to rotate a radio pooler and add other radio hosts who have been denied access, especially local radio hosts who serve as the heartbeat of our country. And we will add additional outlets and reporters who are well suited to cover the news of the day and ask substantive questions of the President of the United States, depending on the news he is making on that given day.
So my opinions on this are, I think, very nuanced, so bear with me. I don't like the notion of the White House, the government, having control, as they said. We're taking control from the White House Correspondents Association of the briefing room. You could say very simply, well, it's their space, they get control. Would you want the Biden administration to have had control of who came in and asked questions? And so I always think of these things in these powers in the hands of someone who I don't agree with politically. And to me, the government having direct control over media access is the antithesis of what our founders wanted for this country. Now, I'm not saying they have to give access to outlets that are, like, for instance, if you're there's so many examples, right? Like if you're a member of the Chinese state media, like I'm not saying the government can't say, hey, no, you can't come in. But when it comes to American legitimate media organizations and outlets, I don't want the White House or any government entity picking winners and losers and making choices about broad access. I mean, they can already make choices about who the president does one-on-one interviews with, who might accompany the president into a certain event or talk to the president exclusively after. The president, if he's somewhere, can call on people. Who am I going to call on for questions? So they already have some control over the access. But to me, I want the pool of reporters who are there day in and day out covering the White House. I want there to be as much separation as possible from the White House in that decision making. And I think we should all want that, right? But that being said, I don't believe that having the White House Correspondents Association have access has been particularly fair or efficient either. They have refused to keep up with the times, to acknowledge that a lot of the legacy outlets don't have the reach they had anymore, don't have the trust of the American people that they had, and they've failed to account for this massive expansion in independent media outlets, in podcasts, in entities like the Free Press, which has been wildly successful and is no doubt producing news and information. And so they have played gatekeeper and sort of these golden tickets to who gets to be in the briefing room for far too long, and I think in a way that has protected their interests. Oh, it's the big five and we get, unfettered access and we get the front row seats so we can be on camera asking the questions. And they have a financial business incentive not to open up that briefing room to more people. So when I listen to Caroline Leavitt's remarks, if the only thing they're going to do is expand access, is let more people in, more voices to ask questions from a different perspective, who serve different types of readerships and viewerships and listenerships, I'm fine. As long as it's expansion and not contraction. As long as you're not kicking people out in favor of outlets you prefer. Because again, would you want Biden to do that? To say, well, Fox News, you can't be here, and we're going to let in so-and-so from another outlet to take your place. Because that's when you get into something that's bordering on state-run media. And it's a really, really slippery slope. And one of the things I'll say, because I've been very consistent on this issue, we're facing a similar problem in Washington State. I've written about it repeatedly a couple years ago when Jonathan Cho had just left Como News and he went out to do his own thing with Discovery Institute. He started being blocked, actually physically blocked from press events. The King County Executive Dow Constantine's office was physically blocking him from a press event, a media availability to tour a homelessness place. The governor's office was refusing to respond to emails or allow Jonathan Cho access to press conferences, et cetera, et cetera. And so at the time I said, it's dangerous when politicians decide who the press is. And it's the opposite of what we should be doing as a country. And so what we're seeing in Washington State is kind of the opposite of what's happening nationally. So the White House is trying to lean in to some of these independent, conservative outlets, new media, etc. And in Washington State, they're going out of their way to keep the independent outlets, new media, conservative voices out as much as possible. So to a lesser extent in Washington State, there's something called like the Capitol Correspondents Association, and they control the media passes and they control the media rules for who's a member of the media and who's not. And they have not updated their rules and their guidance to keep up with what media has become. There used to be 24 reporters dedicated to covering the State House in Olympia. They would be there full time. Now there's like 2. So what happens if you keep the rules that you have for access and eventually there's no legacy media outlets who have the resources to have a reporter down there full time during the legislative session? Does just no one get to cover Olympia? I'm sure the Democrats would love that. The other thing I want to say about this, and so again, I have one foot in and one foot out of this whole Caroline Leavitt, am I on their side or not? Because again, as long as they're expanding, and that's what she's suggesting. They're not going to take access away, but they're going to expand access. More access is always better than less access. More voices, whether it's in the State House in press conferences in Olympia or whether it's in the People's House in Washington, D.C., more people there to ask questions of the people in power is always better, right? And why would we not err on the side of more access? So it's interesting when you've got media entities controlling the access, whether, again, it's in Olympia or DC, and they're erring on the side of less access. Like, who made them the gatekeepers? Why do they get to decide who bona fide media outlets and journalists are? And I don't have a perfect solution for it. But again, if the idea, and we're all operating in this space where we believe the role of the free press is to hold powerful people accountable, what's the problem with someone like me who runs an opinion show, going down there and grilling politicians now and then? Does that really bother the legacy media so bad? And the point I would make, someone I'm a huge fan of is Thomas Paine. He wrote Common Sense, and he was an original pamphleteer. So when our country was first founded and the free press and the rights of the free press were enshrined, the free press looked a lot more like what I do and what Jonathan Cho does than what the Seattle Times does and King 5 News does and the Associated Press does. The free press started with the pamphleteers, and these were citizens who were going around raising holy hell, being really hard on politicians and people in power, who had opinions, who had strong opinions, who had strong rebukes of the government. That's what the free press was. So arguably, what the White House is trying to do in including these independent voices, podcasters, bloggers, columnists, radio hosts, is make press access more reflective of what the press was in this country when the First Amendment was written. And so it's this interesting exercise in at what point did the free press and the pamphleteers and these rogue citizens out there spreading these words and trying to help form the country and make the country a better place, at what point did that start to morph into the legacy media that we have today? And to what point did the rest of us who are now doing what the pamphleteers were doing get shut out of the equation and say, you're not the press at all? We're more the press than you are. And so it's an exercise it's a really intellectual exercise in what do we do from here? Because I agree that there has to be a line somewhere. I don't want any Joe Schmo with an iPhone invading press briefings and screaming at people to the point where those of us who actually engage in news and information collection and distribution can't do our jobs. Because it just gets messy, right? But who gets to decide? Where is the line? So my fear with what's happening in the White House, and I think it comes on the back of them blocking the access for the Associated Press, is that they're going to abuse this newfound authority to dictate who's in the press room. What I don't want them to see is to shut out outlets that did a story on them that they didn't like that day. Even if the story was wrong, even if the story was unfair, there's supposed to be a clear line between the government and the free press. And I don't want anyone abusing that, even if I agree with them politically, even if I agree with their criticisms of the media. That can't be the road we go down as a country, because you're not going to like it when the shoe's on the other foot. But in this state, the legacy media that's controlling the spaces and the politicians that are trying to dictate who can come in and who can't, they need to realize that the media has changed significantly in the last 10 years, and they are becoming obsolete. And if their goal is truly to make sure that powerful people are held accountable, there shouldn't be any care or concern in the world for giving someone like Jonathan Cho a press pass, for giving me a press pass. We cover the legislature more than any. When you look at the sheer volume of content we put out, we cover the legislature on this show, a podcast, an independent podcast with a staff of 2. We cover the legislature more than any legacy outlet, and it's not even close. More than the Seattle Times, more than the Washington State Standard, more than King 5, Como, Cairo, who have staffs of dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens, more than the Associated Press. We put out 5 hours of content a week, in-depth interviews, all the time on legislative issues during the session. But because you don't like that we have an opinion attached to it, or because we have a motive attached to it, to kill bills or not kill bills, we're not the press, we're not media. Well, the founding fathers would disagree. And the press that they sought to protect with the First Amendment is the press that we are today.